In the heart of Victorian England, a young woman from the humblest of origins dares to dream of practicing medicine, only to be met with the mocking laughter of a proud prince. But when a sudden and mysterious illness strikes him down, and every royal physician fails, it is her hard-won knowledge and relentless courage that stand between him and death. In the span of a single day, scorn turns to dependence, prejudice to respect, and a bond neither of them could have imagined begins to take root. The market swelled and breathed like a living thing, its sounds rising in warm, busy waves against the pale English sky. Wagons rattled over rutted cobbles, a fishmonger's bell clanged once, twice. A vendor laughed as though the morning itself were a marvelous joke. The air bore a mingled scent of fresh bread, wet wool, crushed mint leaves, and the faint sourness of horse manure. It was the kind of late summer morning that made colors sharper. The orange flash of carrots, the clean white of potatoes scrubbed and piled, the green fan of cabbages, and the polished sheen on apples set like small rubies in a wooden crate. She moved through it with a steady, cautious grace, a basket hooked in the crook of her arm. Her hands were stained at the fingertips from hours of scraping bark and crushing leaves to dry them, the stains permanent as the work that had caused them. Each coin in the small purse inside her bodice had a history of its own. An evening spent mending a neighbor's torn cuff by candlelight, a day of foregoing meat so she could sell the extra eggs, a dawn spent gathering marsh plants with cold mud leaching through her boots. Weeks of small economies, none of them glamorous, all of them necessary, had led to this moment. At a corner table, beneath a faded awning patched with rough stitches, she found him. The merchant who sometimes had what no one else did. He had laid out his wares with a careful eye for display. Bundles of dried thyme bound with twine, small packets of crushed chalk, jars of oil tinged gold by herbs steeped within, and, wrapped in a square of pale cloth, tied tightly, a rare root she had been saving to buy. Not a miracle cure. No such thing existed. But useful, if prepared correctly, if administered with patience and observation. She had read what she could find, begged a look at borrowed pages, learned by watching and by doing because there was no other path for her. The root would help her finish what she had started with her calculations on fever reduction. It would help her practice safely. It would make the day's toils worth their aches. She examined it with the same deliberate attention she gave everything. The weight in her palm, the faint, earth-sweet scent, the fine texture in the places where it had been cut cleanly, these were the signs of quality she had learned. Her pulse jumped with a tight little thrill as she counted out her coins in the quiet shade of the awning. The merchant swept them into his palm, knuckles scarred and nails rimmed with dust, and tucked the root into the pale cloth and placed it in her basket as if to bless the transaction. She thanked him under her breath, relief breaking over her like warmth. A stir began at the far end of the square. Heads turned first, and then bodies. A ribbon of sound cut through the market's ordinary clamor, an authoritative trumpet of a horse, a call to make way. Somewhere in the middle distance, a child squealed and was shushed. The flow of the crowd changed direction, as if the entire place had shifted on a hinge. She glanced up. The royal party had entered the square. Not a grand procession. No gilded carriages, no foreign envoys with feathered hats, but the compact precision of a small retinue. A few mounted guards, a standard lifted high enough to clear the heads of men and awnings, the flash of red on a uniform sleeve. Hoofbeats rang off the stones in a rhythm that threaded into the beat of her heart despite her will. She drew back a little, not wanting to be close to that kind of attention, and gathered her basket closer under her arm. People bowed their heads, stepped aside. A vendor flapped his apron as though that alone might compose dignity out of a flurry. The horses passed at a measured pace. The young man at their center did not need a standard to announce him. The cut of his coat, the shine on his boots, the easy seat in the saddle. Any eye could read the rank in the practiced poise of his body. His face was striking not only for its youth, but for the air of restless boredom that clung to it the way fine dust clings to new leather. He scanned the crowd as if it were a show staged for him. His gaze slid over faces and hats and bonnets, then caught on her as she was checking again the wrappings of her purchase. He slowed. It was the smallest gesture, yet the crowd reacted as if a command had been given, tilting away to create a little pocket of space where there had been none. She felt the prickle of attention along the nape of her neck. The basket handle pressed into her arm. The prince's eyes, surely he was the prince, and even if she did not know the exact line of his titles, it hardly mattered, rested on her hands and then lifted to her face. Curiosity there, and something else, amusement, lazy and bright. A guard murmured something to him, and he made an answering remark without looking away from her. It gave him pleasure, that much was obvious. The ritual of the comment offered, the laugh it would provoke from a subordinate, the way strangers would listen for wit from a mouth accustomed to being obeyed. His horse tossed its head. The prince steadied the reins with a light movement of his fingers and directed a question toward her, not unkind, not kind, simply amused. What would a peasant girl do with such a thing? The crowd leaned nearer in a subtle communal forward tilt. Not so very long ago she would have ducked her head and let the moment pass over her, but months of work had hardened something soft inside her and given it an edge. The words came before she could let fear choke them. She explained succinctly the root's characteristic properties, the way it could be dried and powdered, the way it worked on the body when the blood burned too high. She kept her voice level and low so it would not waver. There was nothing theatrical in the recitation. She spoke because she knew, and because he had asked. The prince's laugh came quickly. It was not cruel, but it was careless in the way only the sure can be careless. It skimmed the surface of her composure like a thrown stone disturbing water. He said something about medicine and women, about station and ambition, about knowing one's place. The onlookers made a sound all together, a soft flurry of amusement and discomfort, and the space between her and the horse seemed to narrow to a bright pinpoint that pressed behind her eyes. Heat flashed in her cheeks. Her first impulse was to let the humiliation wash her clean of all desire. But her hands tightened on the basket until the handle bit her palm, and she felt something steadier than outrage take shape. She met his gaze. The moment stretched, taut. He had the look of someone who has tested a door for the simple joy of finding it locked, then lost interest and turned away. He breathed out, the corners of his mouth still lifted, and lifted his hand in a signal to move on. The retinue shifted around him like an obedient animal. Hooves clicked, leather creaked. The horse's snort carried warm and sweet on the scent of hay. He passed her, the guard's shoulders forming a moving wall. The standard swayed once and receded into the angled patchwork of color and light that made up the square. She held very still, feeling the crowd close in again, their attention taken by the spectacle of departure, their whispers already turning into new talk like beyond remembered breezes. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The market's ordinary music returned, yet something in her had altered. It made the familiar feel slightly out of tune. She told herself she would not repeat his words in her mind like a curse. She told herself she had nothing to prove to him or to any guard with polished buttons. Still, the marrow-deep want at the core of her, the want to know, to heal, to understand, rose like a tide. It had cost her too much to surrender it to a stranger's laughter. She steadied herself by cataloging sensory detail, the way she did when the larger emotions threatened to spill. The dampness of the cobbles beneath the thin soles of her shoes, the rush of geese being herded by a boy whose face was grubby but intent, the scratch of straw at the edge of a dray. A woman nearby haggled over an onion and then snorted in triumph. A dog wove through legs, nose at an invisible trail. The light had shifted toward late morning, warmer, more forgiving, and it brought a small forgiveness to her own cheeks as well. She tilted the basket in her arm to reassure herself with the sight of the cloth-wrapped root. It would fit perfectly with the notes she had written late last night, when the house was quiet and the fire was low enough that the room smelled of soot and sleep. She pictured the care with which she would slice and dry it, The storage jar, clean, dry, hidden on a high beam. She would measure, observe, adjust. The work itself would burn away the sting of what had just happened. Effort made humiliation irrelevant. That was the comfort she chose. Her fingers brushed the rim of the basket and met only the rough weave. She looked down, expecting the pale square of cloth tied with string to lie snug against a small paper packet of chalk. She saw the paper. She saw, tucked beside it, the stub of pencil wrapped in a scrap of waxed paper against damp. But there was no pale square. The empty, unmarked space where it should have been seemed to open like a trapdoor at her feet. She crouched automatically, searching the base of the stall, the ground just beyond the wooden table leg, and the narrow cracks between cobbles where small things fell and were lost to the slow sludge of mud. Her breath shortened and cooled in her throat. A gust lifted the edge of the patched awning and snapped it down like a warning. She stood up again, scanning the crowd as if the missing parcel might declare itself with a little flag. For a beat, she thought perhaps she had placed it somewhere else, in the pocket of her skirt, in a fold of the basket cloth. But she knew, with that same practical certainty that guided her through a world not made for her, that she had not. The merchant met her gaze, puzzled and a little wary, and shook his head in a way that said he would be no help. The laughter that had just stung her ears seemed to echo, distant and useless as a memory. She reached into the basket and felt only the ordinary weight of what remained, then ran her fingertips over the places where the cloth might have slipped, finding no reassuring texture, no knot. The crowd flowed past her in warm gusts, a river of bodies moving toward the space the horses had left behind, drawn by the story of their own proximity to grandeur. Somewhere a bell tolled the hour. Her heart thudded hard in her chest, once and then again, as she understood that the precious root she had saved for, bought, and carried with a protectiveness like prayer, was gone. The noise of the market swelled again, pressing in from all sides as she stood in the same patch of cobblestones where she had counted out her coins only minutes ago. The clamor of vendors haggling and customers calling over the noise seemed suddenly far away, like sound muffled by a closed door. All her attention was drawn inward, to the space in her basket where the pale cloth should have been, and outward, to the restless motion of the crowd that might have swallowed it. She crouched, ignoring the damp grit that clung to the hem of her skirt, and ran her gaze along the uneven ground. A scatter of onion skins, a trail of muddy boot prints, the remains of a broken jar glistening faintly in the sunlight, everything but the thing she needed. She searched the legs of the table, the space under a low wooden bench where a boy sat swinging his feet, and even the edge of the street where the cobbles met the churned ruts left by wagons. The merchant watched her, his arms folded loosely, his face calm with the resignation of someone who has seen countless small losses in a place where nothing remains still for long. "It was there when you left my table," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, though not unkind. But his gaze was already sliding to another customer who had stepped forward, clutching a string bag filled with carrots. She had no coin left to tempt him into further interest. She straightened and turned in a slow circle, eyes sharp for the flash of pale cloth among the sea of browns and greys. The thought came, unwelcome but persistent, that someone might have taken it deliberately. The royal party had passed close enough to stir her skirt with the sweep of a guard's boot, their horses pressing the crowd into uneven eddies. In the jostle, a nimble hand could have dipped into her basket, lifted the small bundle without notice, and vanished. The idea settled heavily in her mind, hardening her suspicion into something that felt uncomfortably like certainty. She began to retrace her path, weaving between stalls with her basket clutched close, her eyes scanning the cobblestones for any sign of the cloth wrapping. The scent of fresh bread pulled at her briefly as she passed a baker's stall, but she pressed on, refusing to be distracted. A sharp gust caught a sheet of paper from a vendor's ledger and sent it skimming past her ankles, startling her into a quicker pace. Every turn in the market brought her back to the same realization. There was no sign of the route. The royal guards still lingered at the edge of the square, the prince now some distance away, speaking to an older man in a dark coat. She approached one of the guards, a broad-shouldered man whose polished brass buttons caught the light, She explained, briefly, clearly, that something had gone missing from her basket during the procession. He listened with a polite but distant expression, then shrugged and told her she should keep better watch over her possessions in a crowd. His tone was dismissive, as if the matter were too small for the weight of his notice. Frustration pressed against her ribs. She turned away, her steps taking her toward the fringes of the square where the smell of hay and horse sweat hung in the air. The stables were just beyond a row of narrow buildings, tucked close to the road where the royal party would depart. She slipped into the shadowed lane leading to them, her shoes crunching over stray bits of gravel and straw. The quiet here was different from the market's roar, punctuated by the occasional stamp of a hoof or the low sound of a horse shifting its weight. Inside the stable yard, grooms moved between stalls, their arms full of harness leather and buckets. Horses stood tied in orderly rows, their coats sleek under the shifting patterns of light that fell through gaps in the roof. She kept to the edge, scanning the ground near the posts where tack and supplies were stacked. That was when she saw it. A scrap of pale cloth lying just at the base of a weathered post, its frayed corner fluttering faintly with each movement of air. Her breath caught. Even from a few paces away, she recognized the fabric. She stepped toward it, but before she could take more than 2 strides, a shadow cut across her path. A stable hand, tall and broad through the shoulders, came forward with a slow, deliberate tread. His gaze flicked to the cloth, then to her, and settled into a wary, narrowed stare. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, showing arms roped with muscle from years of labor. The set of his mouth suggested that strangers in this place were a nuisance at best, a threat at worst. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice deep and edged with suspicion. His stance shifted subtly, so that he stood between her and the post where the cloth lay, the movement so practiced it might have been instinct. She opened her mouth to explain, but his expression did not soften. Instead, he glanced down once more at the scrap of cloth, then moved his boot to cover it. The smell of hay was stronger now, mixed with the faint tang of leather oil and the warm animal heat of the horses. Somewhere behind her, a bridle jingled as a groom led a horse past, the animal's breath puffing in steady, damp clouds. The stable hand didn't move. His weight settled squarely over the spot where the cloth had been. The distance between them was only a few feet, yet it felt as impassable as a locked door. The sounds of the market were dim here, the stable enclosing its own world of muted movement and guarded silence. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, the tightness in her chest, making her breath shallow. The stable hand's eyes remained fixed on hers, and in that moment, she knew that whatever was hidden under his boot was not something he meant for her to have again. Then, over the scent of hay and the soft creak of leather, another sound intruded. The crisp, measured rhythm of approaching footsteps, lighter than the stable hands and unfamiliar in their cadence. The shadow in the doorway shifted, and she realized with a jolt that someone else was stepping into the stable. The stable hand's posture shifted almost imperceptibly at the sound of the new arrival. His shoulders drew straighter, his weight adjusted so that his boot pressed more firmly against the scrap of cloth beneath it. A flicker of something, wariness perhaps, passed through his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. The figure who stepped into the stable was instantly recognizable. The young prince moved with the unhurried assurance of someone accustomed to space parting for him wherever he went. He carried no trace of the market's earlier amusement now. His face was composed, the faint lines around his mouth pulled taut. His boots struck the packed earth floor with a muted thud, each step measured and deliberate. The stable hand's expression changed in an instant. The narrowed suspicion vanished, replaced by a deferential stillness. He straightened, lifting his chin slightly, his hands falling to his sides in a posture that suggested readiness to obey. The boot, however, remained exactly where it was, the pressure on the hidden cloth unbroken. The prince's gaze swept the interior of the stable, lingering briefly on the line of horses shifting in their stalls. A flick of his gloved fingers signaled to a groom across the aisle, who began adjusting a saddle. Then, his eyes moved to her. She felt the weight of his attention, sharp and assessing. The air seemed to change temperature in the narrow space between them. Her first instinct was to look away, but pride kept her gaze steady. If he wondered why she stood there with an empty basket at her side, he didn't ask. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the slight tilt of his head that suggested curiosity. Not the mocking curiosity of the market, but something quieter, more intent. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The horses shifted, hooves scuffing softly against the floor. Dust motes turned lazily in the shafts of light filtering through the high gaps in the roof. Somewhere outside, a carriage wheel creaked as it turned. The stable hand broke the silence with a murmured question to the prince about one of the horses. His voice was respectful, almost overly so. The prince glanced at the animal in question, gave a brief nod, and stepped closer to inspect its flank. His attention moved away from her, but she noticed the stable hand's gaze slide back to her face, the challenge in it undisguised. While the prince ran his hand along the horse's side, the stable hand crouched briefly, his body turned away from the doorway. When he rose again, the scrap of cloth was no longer visible on the floor. The motion had been swift, practiced. In his hand, he now carried a small leather satchel, the kind worn soft by years of use. Without looking at her, he slung it over his shoulder. Her breath caught. She knew with the clarity of instinct that the satchel now held the bundle she had lost. It was too small to be the usual stable tools, too carefully taken. But here, in the presence of the prince and the watchful eyes of others, she could not accuse him without risking immediate dismissal, or worse. The prince finished his inspection, patted the horse's neck, and turned back toward the doorway. The stable hand stepped aside with a small bow of his head, his satchel shifting against his hip. She stood very still, her fingers tightening around the basket handle until the weave dug into her palm. As the prince walked past her, the faint scent of leather and clean wool trailed in his wake. He did not speak, though his eyes flickered toward her one last time before he stepped into the daylight. The stable hand waited until his back was turned, then shifted his stance, moving in such a way that placed the satchel squarely between them. She weighed her choices in the space of a few heartbeats. Confront him here and risk drawing unwanted attention, or let him go and try to follow him later. The latter seemed the only option with any hope of recovering the route. She stepped back slowly, keeping her gaze fixed on his face for as long as she dared. The stable hand gave no sign that he noticed her retreat. Instead, he turned toward a stall farther down the row, speaking in low tones to another groom. The satchel remained on his shoulder, the strap tight against the breadth of his back. She slipped out of the stable into the brightness of the afternoon. The sudden light stung her eyes, and the noise of the market, though somewhat faded at this end of the square, felt jarring after the muted air of the stable. She turned toward the nearest corner of the building, positioning herself where she could watch the entrance without being obvious. From here, she could see the movement inside only in fragments. A shifting shadow, the flash of a polished buckle, the dark curve of a horse's flank. She waited, the minutes stretching, her pulse quickening with each step and voice that reached her ears. When at last the stable hand emerged, the satchel was still in place, the strap pulled snug across his chest. He glanced once toward the market, then toward the road leading out of the square. She eased herself into the flow of people moving in that direction, careful to keep her distance. He walked with a purpose that made his broad frame easy to follow. The satchel swung slightly with each step, the faint creak of its leather just audible when she drew a little closer. The air carried the scent of horse sweat from the stables and the sharper tang of coal smoke from chimneys beyond the square. She told herself to keep her focus on the weight and shape of that satchel, on the way it shifted against his back. Yet each time he glanced over his shoulder, her heart gave a quick, tight jolt, certain he might have caught her in the act. When he reached the edge of the market, he slowed briefly to adjust the strap, scanning the street ahead as though choosing his path. She pressed herself into the shelter of a doorway, half hidden by a rack of drying laundry. The stable hand took a step forward, then another, turning down a narrow street lined with brick buildings, whose windowsills overflowed with geraniums. She waited just long enough for the distance between them to stretch, then stepped out to follow, her eyes fixed on the bobbing arc of the satchel's strap as it disappeared into the shadows of the lane. The narrow street swallowed her in its cooler air, the high brick walls on either side casting long, slanted shadows across the cobblestones. The stable hand's broad figure was easy to pick out ahead, though he moved with the slow confidence of someone who knew he wasn't being followed. His satchel swung with each step, the faint creak of leather barely reaching her ears when the wind paused. She kept to the edge of the lane, careful to match her pace to his while letting the gap between them widen just enough to avoid notice. The street curved gently, revealing rows of closely built houses with white-trimmed windowsills, heavy with red geraniums. Coal smoke drifted faintly in the air, mingling with the smell of damp brick and the yeast of bread cooling somewhere nearby. A cat dozed on a low stone wall, its tail twitching lazily at the sound of approaching footsteps. The stable hand's head turned once, a brief glance over his shoulder. She ducked her gaze toward the uneven cobblestones and slowed as though examining her footing. When she lifted her eyes again, he had resumed his steady pace, the satchel bumping lightly against his hip. He turned down a narrower alley, branching off the main lane. The space tightened, the walls now close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed the rough brick as she followed. Puddles from an earlier rain mirrored shards of the overcast sky, and the smell here was sharper, coal dust and something medicinal, metallic, lingering faintly on the air. The sound of his boots was louder in the confined space, a steady rhythm she matched step for step, pausing whenever he slowed. At the alley's end, the buildings opened slightly, revealing a side gate tucked behind a shuttered shop. The paint on the gate was weathered, its hinges dark with rust, but it stood solid and upright against the brick wall. The stable hand glanced around once, then reached into his coat and drew out a key. The gesture was quick, practiced, as if this was not the first time he had used it. The lock turned with a muffled click, and he slipped inside without hesitation. The gate closed behind him with a soft thud, shutting her out of view. She approached quietly, her shoes making little sound on the damp stones, and rested her palm lightly against the cool wood. The grain was rough beneath her fingers, the scent of the alley mingling now with a faint whiff of herbs that seemed to drift from the other side. Through the thin slats, muffled voices reached her, one low and hurried, the stable hand's, the other older, sharper, carrying an edge of impatience. She could not make out full sentences, only the rhythm of exchange, the way the older voice occasionally cut across the other like a knife slicing through cloth. Her heartbeat quickened. The voices moved deeper into the building, their sound slightly muted, then returned to the gate's side, sharper and more distinct. The older voice rose briefly, as if issuing a warning. The stable hand's tone dipped in response, his words quick and indistinct. The faint rattle of metal followed, perhaps coins, perhaps something else being shifted from hand to hand. She pressed her ear closer, straining to catch more. A sudden scrape of wood against wood came from within, followed by a soft metallic clink. The smell of herbs grew stronger. Dried leaves, bitter roots, underscored by a hint of something less familiar, faintly acrid. Her fingers curled against the wood as she leaned in, careful not to let the hinges creak. The conversation dipped, then swelled again. A pause, and then she heard footsteps, slow at first, then coming directly toward the gate. She stepped back into the narrowest strip of shadow against the wall, her pulse thudding against her ribs. The latch on the inside of the gate clicked. The wood began to swing inward, revealing the dim space beyond. A figure filled the opening, framed by the faint lamplight from within. And it was not the stable hand. The man who stepped into the doorway was older, his shoulders rounded but still solid beneath a dark coat that smelled faintly of camphor and smoke. The lamplight behind him traced the lines of a gaunt face and glinted off the narrow rims of spectacles perched low on his nose. His eyes swept the alley, sharp and searching, and paused when they found her standing in the shadow. For a moment, neither moved. The sounds from inside the shop had quieted, the stable hand's voice no longer audible. Only the faint hum of a fly against the lamplight and the soft drip of water from a gutter broke the stillness. The man's gaze held her in place, weighing, measuring, as if deciding whether she belonged in the narrow space between the gate and the wall. She stepped forward enough to be seen clearly, her hands at her sides, the basket still hooked in the crook of her arm. Her voice felt tight in her throat as she explained that she had lost something of value to her, and had reason to believe it might have found its way here. His expression didn't soften. If anything, the slight tilt of his head suggested a guarded calculation. From deeper inside came the muted shuffle of boots on wooden planks, then the faint clink of glass against glass. The man shifted, his body still blocking the doorway, and glanced briefly over his shoulder before stepping aside. It was not an invitation, more an act of practical necessity to allow someone behind him to pass. The stable hand emerged from the dim interior, his satchel still slung over his shoulder, though it now sagged with less weight. His gaze flickered over her without surprise, but a faint tension pulled at his jaw. He moved toward the older man, said something too low for her to catch, and handed over a small parcel wrapped in paper. The older man accepted it with one hand, and with the other, reached for a small pouch that jingled softly. Her eyes followed the exchange, her mind marking every movement. The quickness of the trade, the way the stable hand's shoulders eased once the parcel was gone, the way the older man tucked the coin pouch into his coat as if sealing away the matter. The older man's voice, when it came, was sharper now, more insistent. The words carried the crispness of instruction or warning, though their meaning was lost under the low tone and the muffling effect of the alley. The stable hand gave a short nod, his gaze drifting toward the street as if eager to be gone. As they spoke, a faint sound reached her ears, a metallic scrape, like the lid of a tin being opened or a clasp undone. Her gaze darted toward the source, just in time to see a corner of cloth peeking from beneath the older man's arm as he adjusted the parcel. It was pale, frayed at the edge, and so familiar that her breath caught. The stable hand noticed her focus and shifted, his broad frame blocking her line of sight. A shadow passed across his features, half warning, half challenge. She took a step closer, her pulse tightening in her throat. The older man seemed oblivious to the silent exchange, preoccupied with securing the small parcel under his arm. Yet as he moved, the faint scent of dried herbs and earth, herbs that had once been hers, rose into the damp air of the alley. A flicker of voices came from the interior again, distant but distinct enough for her to hear the words, "the prince," and "symptoms." Her stomach tightened. The stable hand replied quickly, his tone low and hurried, but she couldn't make out the full sentence. The older man's expression darkened, as though the answer had not pleased him. The sound of boots scuffing against the floorboards inside drew closer to the doorway, as if someone else might be joining them. The older man turned sharply, his coat flaring slightly, and reached for the latch on the gate as though to close it. She didn't move back this time. Every instinct told her to stay rooted where she was, to catch whatever truth might slip through in the next breath. The latch lifted with a clean, deliberate motion, the wood beginning to swing toward her. From inside, a shadow loomed, stretching across the threshold as the faint lamplight wavered. The figure that stepped forward stopped just short of the doorway, the outline of his frame cutting off the view to the room beyond, and in that instant, she realized he was looking directly at her. The man in the doorway was not the stable hand, nor the older merchant, but someone entirely different, tall, straight-backed, dressed in the dark livery of the Royal Guard. His coat, fitted close to his frame, bore polished buttons that caught the wavering lamplight. His eyes fixed on her instantly, narrowing in a way that conveyed recognition, though she could not recall ever seeing him before. He stepped forward, the wooden gate swinging wider as he closed the distance between them. The faint scent of leather, cold air, and a trace of horses clung to him. Without preamble, his hand came down on her arm, not roughly, but with a firm grip that allowed no thought of refusal. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice low but edged with authority. The older man in the coat stiffened, but did not intervene, his lips pressing into a thin line. The stable hand's gaze flickered between them, his jaw tightening. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might speak, but the guard's presence commanded silence. She felt the warm press of the guard's fingers through the fabric of her sleeve, guiding her away from the gate and back into the narrow alley. The air outside the shop felt sharper now, tinged with the distant noise of the market and the faint clatter of hooves from beyond the lane. They moved at a clipped pace, her shoes skimming over uneven cobblestones slick with recent rain. She tried to ask where they were going, but the guard's silence was unbroken, except for the rhythm of his boots. The alley opened into a wider street, where the distant shape of the royal procession loomed. The square had thinned of common shoppers. The market's earlier energy was fading into the measured movements of the prince's attendants. Carriages stood waiting, their polished sides reflecting the pale afternoon light. Horses shifted, snorting softly, their breath steaming in the cool air. The guard did not slow until they reached a smaller carriage near the rear of the line. Its door stood open, the steps lowered. He gestured her inside. She hesitated at the threshold, glancing toward the front of the procession where the prince sat astride a dark bay, his posture slightly slouched. His gloved hand adjusted the reins, but even from here she could see the stiffness in the movement. The guard's hand urged her forward. She climbed into the carriage, the smell of leather seats mingling with the faint scent of damp wood from the paneling. The door shut behind her, and the wheels jolted as the carriage began to roll. Through the small window, she caught fragments of the road, cobbles flashing beneath, the lower half of a groom leading a horse, a child standing on tiptoe to watch the procession pass. The ride was not long, but the steady motion and muffled clatter of hooves gave her time to notice things she might otherwise have missed. The way the prince's head dipped once, as though from fatigue, the subtle exchange between two riders at his side, the flicker of unease on the face of one attendant who glanced back toward her carriage. The streets changed gradually from the muddled closeness of the market quarter to wider, cleaner roads, bordered by high stone walls and gates wrought in iron. Trees lined the way, their branches bare against the pale sky. The smell of smoke from household chimneys lingered in the air, carried by a faint wind. The carriage turned sharply, passing through a gate flanked by guards in matching livery. The gravel under the wheels gave a muted crunch, the sound distinct from the clatter of city stones. Ahead, the roof lines of the royal estate emerged, steep gables, tall chimneys, windows catching what little light the day still held. When they stopped, the guard opened the door and offered a hand for her to step down. His grip was steady, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he guided her through a side entrance of the building, away from the main doors where liveried servants bustled to and fro. The corridors inside were hushed, the air warmer and scented faintly with beeswax and coal. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following in solemn silence. Her footsteps, muffled by thick carpet runners, sounded almost too loud in the stillness. They ascended a short flight of stairs and turned down a narrower hallway, the muted clink of glass and murmur of voices drifting from somewhere ahead. The guard paused before a tall door, knocked once, and then pushed it open. The room beyond was brightened by the glow of a fire, though the scent in the air was sharper, herbal, and tinged with something metallic. A physician stood at the bedside, his posture attentive, his hand resting on the rim of a porcelain basin filled with water stained faintly green. The prince lay against crisp white linens, his face pale, his breathing shallow, but even. Her gaze darted to the basin again. The liquid's color and faint scent told her at once it was a poorly prepared infusion, too strong in some elements, too weak in others. It would do little more than sap his remaining strength. The physician murmured to an older man in formal dress, likely a courtier, whose eyes held the tight watchfulness of someone accustomed to managing delicate matters. When the courtier's gaze shifted to her, it was with an air of measuring her worth in an instant. For a moment, no one spoke to her. The sounds in the room were soft but distinct. The faint hiss of the fire, the whisper of fabric as the physician adjusted his sleeve, the shallow draw of the prince's breath. She stepped closer, almost without thinking, her eyes narrowing as she took in the slight swelling at his throat, the dull cast to his skin. The symptoms wove themselves together in her mind, each detail clicking into place alongside the scent from the basin. The prince's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then fixing on her face with slow recognition. His lips parted. She leaned forward, expecting a question, but his voice came out in a low, ragged murmur, shaping a single word that made her breath catch. Poison. The word hung in the air between them, small yet heavy, as though it carried the weight of something that could not be recalled once spoken. His breath hitched after it, the effort drawing a faint crease between his brows. She remained bent toward him for a moment longer, searching his eyes for any sign that she had misheard. But the look in them was clear enough, faint but urgent, as though he had used the last of his strength to give shape to that single truth. Before she could speak, the physician returned to the bedside, his shadow falling over both of them. He adjusted the quilt at the prince's chest, glancing at her with a professional detachment that dismissed her presence as swiftly as it acknowledged it. The courtier drew closer as well, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, his eyes shifting from the prince to her, with a question unasked but plainly visible. The moment dissolved under their watch. She stepped back, allowing the physician room to work, though her mind was far from still. If what the prince said was true, the herbs in the basin were useless. Worse, they might be doing harm. Poison was a thing that worked quickly or slowly depending on its source, but always it demanded precision in response. Precision these men clearly did not have. She could not intervene openly, not yet. The courtier's assessing gaze would turn sharp with suspicion at the smallest misstep. Instead, she held her silence, tucking the prince's words into her mind like a fragile, smoldering coal. She needed to find the source. Without that, she would be fumbling in the dark. The physician leaned to murmur something to the courtier. His tone was low, but she caught the edge of frustration in it, as if he had exhausted his options. The courtier's nod was slow and grave, his eyes drifting again toward the prince's face, as if willing him to rally without further interference. A guard stepped into the doorway, announcing that the kitchens had prepared the evening trays. The courtier excused himself, the physician following after a final glance at his patient. The guard remained in the hall, his stance casual but watchful, clearly intended to keep her from wandering freely. She moved to the far side of the room, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of a small table where an untouched goblet sat beside a plate, holding a slice of bread. The scent from the goblet was faint, sweet, and not unfamiliar. Wine, though diluted. It bore no hint of the acrid undertone she had smelled in the basin. Whatever had sickened him had not come from this. Her mind sifted through what she had seen, the symptoms, the infusion, the prince's whispered warning. If poison had entered his body, it had likely come with something he consumed regularly enough to pass unnoticed. That meant food, drink, or some medicinal additive. Something easily masked. Her gaze drifted to the doorway, where the guard's attention had wandered briefly toward the corridor. She stepped past him with quiet purpose, her pace unhurried so as not to draw comment. The corridor smelled faintly of smoke and roasted meat, the air warmer as she neared the kitchens. The clatter of pans and hum of voices reached her before she crossed the threshold. Inside, the staff moved quickly in a rhythm of practiced familiarity, chopping, stirring, passing platters from one station to another. A cook at the far table was slicing bread, his knife flashing in the lamplight. At a smaller side counter, a kitchen boy was ladling honey from a jar into a porcelain dish. It was the scent that stopped her. Sweet at first, then layered with a subtle bitterness that curled at the edges of her senses like smoke. She moved closer under the guise of observing the busy counter. The boy set the jar down, and she reached for it, lifting it toward her face. The sweetness was almost cloying, but beneath it was a note she recognized instantly from her own studies, a plant-derived toxin, rare but not impossible to come by, difficult to detect unless one knew precisely what to seek. She lowered the jar quickly as the boy turned toward her, his expression uncertain. He hesitated, then lifted the dish of honey and started toward a side passage that led away from the main kitchen. Her pulse quickened. Without drawing attention, she followed him into the dimmer corridor. The sound of footsteps ahead told her he was moving quickly. She turned a corner just in time to see him enter a small, shadowed room near the rear gate. The air here was cooler, the scents of the kitchen replaced by damp wood and the faint musk of stored grain. Through the half-open door, she caught sight of him handing the honey jar to the stable hand. The same satchel rested at the man's side, its flap open just enough to reveal a glimpse of cloth and paper. The stable hand accepted the jar with a nod, his hand closing firmly around it as though claiming a prize. She stepped forward, her breath sharp in her chest. The stable hand looked up, his eyes finding hers across the dim space, and his expression shifted into something between recognition and suspicion. The stable hand's gaze lingered on her with the wariness of a man who had been caught mid-act. His grip on the honey jar tightened until his knuckles whitened, the faint scrape of glass against his calloused palm audible in the stillness of the room. The kitchen boy shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing between them as though sensing the air had turned dangerous. She stepped inside, the wooden floor cool beneath her thin soles, the scent of the honey's hidden bitterness curling faintly into the air between them. Her eyes moved from the jar to the stable hand's satchel, where the edge of a pale cloth peeked from beneath the flap before disappearing as he adjusted it with one quick motion. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, almost a growl, his stance squaring as if to block her from advancing further. The boy moved toward the wall, clearly seeking escape, but the stable hand's arm shot out, halting him with a curt gesture. She kept her voice even, though her pulse thudded in her ears. "That honey is poisoned." His expression didn't shift, though the tightening of his jaw betrayed the blow of her words. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, the dismissal forced, too sharp to be convincing. "I know the scent," she replied, each word deliberate, "and I know what it will do." The boy's eyes darted to the jar in the stable hand's grip, then to the doorway. He looked younger in this dim light, his uncertainty plain. The stable hand must have read it too, for his voice snapped in a harsher tone. "Go." The boy hesitated, then slipped past her, his steps quickening once he reached the corridor beyond. She heard the faint echo of his retreat down the passage, leaving the two of them alone. She took a step closer, the scent of the toxin more pronounced now that the space between them had closed. "If you've given this to the prince, there's no undoing it without the right remedy," she said. "And there are precious few who know how to prepare it." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Not guilt, but a shadow of doubt. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to gauge how much she truly knew. "I was paid to bring it," he said at last, the words clipped. "That's all." "By whom?" He looked away, the set of his shoulders hardening again. "It doesn't matter. It matters to him." Her voice softened, though her urgency sharpened. "And it matters to you, whether you see it now or not. Tell me who gave it to you." The pause that followed was long enough for her to hear the faint creak of the building settling around them. The stable hand shifted his weight, the jar still cradled in one hand. Finally he spoke, his tone low, almost reluctant. He named the older man she had seen in the alley, the same one who had taken her stolen root into his keeping. The pieces clicked together in her mind with sudden clarity. The parcel, the whispered talk of the prince, the bitterness in the honey. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her face composed. The sound of boots striking the corridor floor pulled both their gazes toward the door. A pair of guards appeared in the threshold, their eyes sweeping the room in a quick assessment before settling on the stable hand. "What's this?" one of them asked, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword as though the habit were second nature. The stable hand's mouth opened, but she spoke first, her words crisp and certain. "That jar may be the reason your prince lies in bed with poison in his body. Take it, carefully, and test it." The guards exchanged a glance, then one stepped forward, holding out a gloved hand. The stable hand hesitated only a breath before relinquishing the jar, his jaw set in a defiant line. The second guard took him by the arm, securing his other wrist with a leather strap. "You'll answer for this," the man said, his tone flat, without anger. The stable hand didn't resist as they led him toward the hall, though his gaze met hers in passing, steady, unreadable, with the faintest trace of something that might have been warning or resignation. She remained in the small room, her attention fixed on the jar now in the guard's possession. It was gone from her hands, but its danger still lingered in the air, as real as the smell of the toxin itself. One guard paused at the doorway, looking back at her. "You said there's a remedy," he said. She nodded. "I can make it." The guard gave a brief nod before disappearing into the corridor, the sound of their steps fading until the room was left in silence. Her mind moved quickly, calculating what she would need, how much time might be left, whether the prince's body could withstand the delay. The stolen root, if it was still intact, would be enough to prepare the antidote. But that meant retrieving it before the illness advanced, beyond the reach of any cure. She turned toward the corridor, her steps quick and sure. The hall seemed narrower now, the air heavier, as though the building itself understood the urgency pressing against her ribs. She reached the main staircase and began to climb, the faint murmur of voices growing louder above. When she reached the landing, the court physician was there, speaking with a footman who held a folded cloth in his hands. The physician's eyes met hers briefly, an unreadable flicker passing through them before he turned back to his conversation. She slipped past, heading toward the prince's chamber. The guards at his door didn't stop her. Perhaps the order had already been given. Inside, the fire still burned low, and the prince lay much as she had left him. Paler now, his lips dry, the shallow rise and fall of his chest more labored. The courtier stood at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on the prince's face. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing in thought. "What have you found?" he asked. "The source," she said simply, "and the means to counter it." His mouth pressed into a thin line, but he gave a single curt nod. "Then do it." Her pulse surged, both with urgency and the weight of the task. She moved to the bedside, already picturing each step of the remedy in her mind. But when she reached for her basket to retrieve what she needed, her hand closed on nothing but the empty weave of its bottom. Her fingers searched the basket again, as though the missing root might have somehow reappeared between the weave, but the hollow space mocked her with its lightness. The courtier's eyes followed her movements, his gaze tightening as he seemed to realize the implication. "It was stolen earlier," she said, her voice steady despite the twist in her stomach. "But I know where it is, and I can recover enough to make the antidote." The courtier gave no visible sign of approval, only a single measured glance toward the door, as if granting her passage without speaking the words. She didn't wait for more. Turning, she strode from the chamber, the guard stepping aside. The corridors blurred into a rush of stone and shadow, her mind fixed on the one place the root might still be, in the hands of those who had taken it from her. The stable hand was in custody, but the older man from the alley, he was still unaccounted for. She remembered the set of his shoulders, the cloth parcel tucked under his arm, the faint herbal scent that had clung to him. When she reached the lower level, the air shifted to a cooler draft, scented faintly of rain from the open courtyard beyond. Two guards stood near a side door, speaking in low tones. She asked for the stable hand, and one of them gestured toward a small stone chamber nearby. Inside, the man sat on a wooden bench, his wrists no longer bound, but resting heavily on his knees. His head lifted at her approach, and for a moment his eyes sharpened with recognition, then dulled into something like resignation. "You said you were paid to bring the honey," she began. "The man who paid you still has something of mine, something that will save the prince's life. Where is he?" The stable hand's gaze dropped to the floor, his jaw tightening. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint drip of water from somewhere in the stonework. "You've seen what this poison does," she pressed. "If you won't help me, it will be his death. Do you want that on you?" His shoulders shifted, the movement small but telling. He drew a slow breath, then muttered the name of the apothecary she already knew, confirming the suspicion that had been growing since the market. The man kept a small shop at the edge of town, and according to the stable hand, he did not work alone. She left without another word, the stable hand's information etched sharply in her thoughts. The courtier was waiting in the corridor, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. She relayed what she had learned, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the truth she had carried all along. Within minutes, 2 guards were dispatched toward the town. She stayed behind, knowing her part was not in the capture, but in preparing the antidote as soon as the root was recovered. Every heartbeat the prince spent under the toxin's influence was another thread fraying in the fabric of his life. She returned to the chamber, the scent of herbs and smoke heavier now in the warm air. The physician stood at the bedside, speaking in low tones to the prince, whose eyelids fluttered with exhaustion. The courtier entered behind her, giving the physician a brief nod that carried a silent order to step aside. When the physician moved away, she took his place. The prince's gaze found her through half-closed lids, his breathing shallow, but steady enough to answer her unspoken question. He was still holding on. "You'll have what you need," the courtier said quietly at her shoulder. "Be ready." She inclined her head, her eyes never leaving the prince's face. The minutes that followed stretched long, each marked by the muted crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. At last, the sound of boots on the corridor floor broke the stillness. The door opened to admit the guards, one of them holding a parcel wrapped in familiar pale cloth. She reached for it before the words of confirmation had even left his mouth. The knot in the string came loose beneath her fingers, revealing the root within, still intact. Relief flared through her, tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part was still to come. She moved to the table, setting out what she needed with quick, efficient motions. A kettle of water was placed within reach. The knife in her hand flashed once in the firelight as she cut the root into precise slices. The scent rose immediately, earthy and sharp, promising the possibility of life where moments before there had been only decline. The courtier watched in silence, the weight of his attention a constant presence at her back. The physician, though standing apart, leaned subtly forward as if unable to help himself. Every movement she made was deliberate, the measuring, the timing, the slow stir of the infusion as it deepened in color. When it was ready, she poured the liquid into a small cup, its surface steaming faintly. She carried it to the bedside, her steps measured, her focus fixed on the man who had once mocked her in the marketplace and now lay at the fragile edge of breath. She supported his head just enough to bring the cup to his lips. The first swallow was slow, almost reluctant, but he took it. Another followed, and another, until the cup was empty. She set it aside, her hand remaining lightly at his shoulder as she watched for the smallest change in his breathing. The courtier exhaled quietly behind her, as though realizing only now that he had been holding his breath. The physician returned to the bedside, checking the prince's pulse with a careful hand. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, a hint of color touched the prince's cheeks, faint but present. The courtier's gaze met hers, and in that glance was the acknowledgement of a barrier crossed. Outside, the wind rose, rattling faintly against the window panes. The fire popped in the grate. Somewhere deep within the silence, the prince drew a steadier breath. The minutes after the antidote felt suspended, as though the room itself was holding its breath alongside them. She kept her gaze on the prince's face, watching for each faint shift. The slow deepening of his breaths, the faint warmth beginning to creep back into his skin. The physician remained at his side, fingertips pressed lightly against his wrist, counting the beats with quiet concentration. The courtier stood a little apart, one hand resting on the back of a chair, his eyes moving between her and the prince. His posture was rigid, but there was no mistaking the subtle easing in his features. The tension in the room had not disappeared, but it had softened at the edges. She sat back slightly, though her attention never wavered. The steam from the empty cup still curled in the cool air, carrying the root's earthy scent. The smell clung faintly to her hands, a reminder of how close this had come to ending differently. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the distant sound of voices from the courtyard, guards exchanging brief words, the muted clink of harness buckles. The fire's glow deepened against the lengthening shadows, casting a warm light over the bed. The prince stirred. His eyelids lifted with effort, but his gaze was clearer now, holding hers with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She leaned forward, not speaking, unwilling to break whatever fragile thread was pulling him back toward the living. He swallowed once, as if testing the ease of it, and the corners of his mouth moved, not into a smile, but into something close to recognition. His voice, when it came, was low but free of the ragged edge it had carried earlier. "You stayed." She nodded once. "I had to." His eyes held hers for a moment longer, and then his gaze shifted toward the courtier, who inclined his head slightly, as though answering an unspoken question. The physician murmured something about continued rest, but the words hardly seemed to touch him. His attention returned to her, lingering there in a way that was neither command nor dismissal. She could feel the courtier's gaze still on them, a silent witness to the change that had taken root in the space between their first meeting and this moment. The prince seemed to sense it too. Whatever pride or reserve had once drawn a line between them now felt altered, thinned by the weight of what they had endured in these past hours. The fire popped softly, and in its glow she noticed how the pallor in his face was giving way, little by little, to a healthier flush. The physician replaced the quilt around his shoulders, his movements more assured now that the danger had begun to recede. The courtier stepped closer, speaking to her in a quieter tone. "You have done more than any of us could have asked." Her answer was simple. "I did what was needed." The prince's lips curved faintly, enough to catch the firelight and reflect it back in a small gleam. It was not mockery, not the careless amusement of the marketplace, but something warmer, acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. She remained by the bed until his breathing settled into an easier rhythm. Only then did she allow herself to relax, the strain in her shoulders loosening. The warmth from the fire seeped into her, chasing away the chill that had clung to her since morning. When she finally rose, intending to step back and give him space to rest, his hand lifted slightly from the quilt. The movement was small, but it was enough to still her. She reached forward, her fingers brushing lightly against his, not to take his hand, but to let him know she had understood the request unspoken. The quiet between them was no longer filled with tension. It carried instead the slow, steady beat of something new, an understanding forged in necessity, but holding the shape of something more enduring. The courtier, perhaps sensing it, withdrew toward the far side of the room. The physician busied himself at the table, rinsing the cup and setting it aside. The wind outside had eased, leaving only the low hum of the fire and the occasional rustle of the prince shifting beneath the quilt. She remained where she was for a while longer, her fingers resting lightly at the edge of the coverlet. His eyes, though growing heavy with the pull of sleep, stayed on her until they finally closed. The room was still. She allowed herself one long breath, deep enough to feel it steady her from the inside out. The danger had passed. The remedy had worked. But as she watched the faint rise and fall of his chest, she knew that the bond formed here, born from scorn, tested by suspicion, and sealed in survival, was something neither of them would be able to ignore. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, We want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.